For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brittany Dunn. I am the CEO and co-founder of Safe House Project. I am not normally the one facilitating our panels or our webinar series, but it is my pleasure to have Alia Dweez, our Director of Aftercare, on the panel today. As you all knew, we are going to be discussing decriminalization, and we have some incredible individuals here with us today who have really worked to understand this really important issue. The first individual I want to introduce you all to is Yasmin Vafa. She is the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls, a national human rights organization dedicated to ending gender-based violence against young women and girls in the U.S. She is an award-winning human rights attorney and advocate. Her work focuses on the intersections of race, gender, violence, and the law. She is nationally recognized expert on gendered violence. She has successfully advocated for several laws at the federal and state levels, testified before the U.S. Senate and international human rights bodies, and co-authored several reports exposing the criminalization of girls and young women of color, particularly survivors of sexual violence. Yasmin and her work have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, ABC News, NBC News, and more. She currently serves on the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth, is an adjunct educator for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, where she is lead faculty for the National Judicial Institute on Domestic Child Sex Trafficking. She is also a founding co-chair of World Without Exploitation, a national coalition of over 200 anti-trafficking organizations working to end human trafficking and sexual exploitation. So first of all, thank you, Yasmin, for making time. Your expertise goes before you, so thank you. We also have Bill Wolf, recipient of the Presidential Medal for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Trafficking. And he is a former police detective, last assigned to the Child Exploitation Unit as a task force officer with the FBI. He has also served as the lead investigator and co-director of the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force. In addition to managing the task force, he was responsible for investigating all facets of human trafficking, compelling intelligence on trafficking trends and methods, tracking and interdicting trafficking activities, and disseminating information throughout the DC metropolitan area in an effort to make the war against human trafficking more effective. Mr. Wolf was called upon to join the U.S. Department of Justice and serves as the Director of Human Trafficking Programs, as well as the Acting Director of the Office of Victims of Crime. Bill has also been recognized as a national expert regarding human trafficking, with a particular focus on the victimization of those who have been exploited. He has been called upon to testify in front of the United States Congress, as well as assisting other government agencies in the development and implementation of policy. And he is an adjunct professor at both George Mason University and Mount Aloysius College. Did I get that, Bill?
Aloysius, close.
Aloysius, okay. I apologize if anybody is an alum and I butchered that. And finally, Alia, Director of Aftercare Development for Safe House Project, is a survivor of underage sex trafficking and adult exploitation in the counties of Ventura and Los Angeles. In this capacity, she endeavors nationally to influence the policies and procedures involved in the identification and care of today's youth survivors. She believes restorative care is essential to the healing of many who have experienced sexual exploitation, and that no survivor is ever too far gone to find complete healing and purpose to pursue their personal dreams. She currently manages a certification process to assist restorative care programs and ensuring they're best utilizing best practices, and speaks at the national level about her lived experience and the importance of survivor involvement in the fight against trafficking. As you all can tell, we have three unbelievable people with us today who really have seen this issue from a wide variety of lenses. And so to make the most of our time today, I'm going to make sure I talk as little as possible and that they get the opportunity to really highlight the various areas where they have served. So I want to start by baselining our understanding on the idea of decriminalization. The word decriminalization gets used to refer to a myriad of different models of legislation. So Yasmin, can you describe the models that are currently in discussion and baseline us on where we are now as a country, and what are those considerations at the state and local level?
Sure. What has really been happening over the last several years is an effort to reform our current sex trade policies and really our prostitution policies. Across most of the United States, what we have is what is often referred to as full prohibition. So basically all across the United States, outside of a handful of counties in Nevada, all aspects of prostitution are criminalized. And so the act of selling sex, the act of buying sex, the act of facilitation or profiting off the sale of someone else, what we commonly refer to as pimping, as well as brothels or brothel owning, are all prohibited. And what we have seen over the last several years is that this hasn't really done anything to reduce the issue of prostitution. It hasn't done anything to help some of our most marginalized individuals in the sex trade. What we know from survivors is that many of the adults in the sex trade were the child sex trafficking victims of yesterday who have just basically grown up in the industry. And that they often bear the brunt of prostitution arrests. And so this criminalization policy has essentially kept a lot of those individuals trapped. And so there have been some very well-intentioned efforts at seeking to reform our policies. And so what we have seen is three real suggestions as to how to reform the industry. The first policy approach that we have seen floated, and this was the first suggestion that we saw a number of years ago, and what people I think are most familiar with is the policy approach of legalization. And this is what we see in places like the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Germany, and again, a handful of counties in Nevada, but only inside of licensed brothels. And legalization would essentially render the acts of selling sex, buying sex, pimping, and brothel keeping as legal. And what it does is institute a regulation scheme, and it renders these acts legal and institutes licensing. And what it does, and what we have seen in a number of these countries, is that it's led to an influx of sex trafficking by inviting more men into the sex market as clients, as new clients. It increases sex tourism. And what we've seen in countries like the Netherlands and Germany, it has led to increases in sex trafficking. It has attracted organized crime. And those countries have really essentially admitted that it has been a failure. And so across the globe, we don't really see people pushing for legalization anymore. It's basically been recognized by all parties as an abject failure. The other approach that we are now seeing really pushed for is what's known as full decriminalization, what's commonly referred to as decriminalizing sex work. This is what is, I think, really pushed for. We see this a lot in the media. We see this a lot amongst progressive groups and communities. And what I think is really clever about this pitch is people often think decriminalizing sex work means just decriminalizing the individuals who are selling sex. But what decriminalizing sex work actually encompasses is a full decriminalization approach. And so what it would do is actually a more aggressive form of legalization. And what this means is that it would essentially repeal all of the laws around prostitution. So it would repeal the prohibitions against selling sex. It would repeal the prohibitions against buying sex, repeal the prohibitions against pimping and brothel owning. And so effectively, it would render all of those acts legal, but there would be no regulation. It would essentially be a full deregulation of the commercial sex market. And this is very concerning. The one country that has really implemented this over a significant period of time is New Zealand. And we can talk about some of the effects that we've seen in that country. A lot of people don't actually know, but Rhode Island experimented with full decriminalization of indoor prostitution for about a 30-year period between 1988 to about 2009. And then they reversed course very sharply as a result of what they experienced. And then the last policy approach that is being suggested is what's known as partial decriminalization. And so this is the approach that is the prevailing global policy approach in the countries and jurisdictions that have really examined this issue, that have really talked to survivors of sexual exploitation, both those who are currently engaged in the commercial sex trade and those who have exited, and looked at the data around sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, and the power imbalances amongst those who are involved in the sex trade have really supported this approach. And most countries that have reformed their sex industry have taken this approach. And what it does is decriminalize the act of selling sex, yet maintain the criminal prohibitions against buying sex, pimping, and brothel owning. This is also known in some places as the Nordic model, as the equality model, the abolition model. It has lots of different names depending on the jurisdiction, but it's been adopted in a number of countries. And these are the dominant policy approaches. There's a lot of debate, but it's important to know that in the last, I'd say, few years, full decriminalization has been ramping up in a number of jurisdictions. So just in the last 2 years or so, there have been bills or ballot initiatives in the state of Oregon, Louisiana, Washington, D.C., Vermont, Rhode Island, New York, a number of jurisdictions. So this is something that's really happening. There's a lot of funding behind this. People don't really understand the full impact of what this could entail. So it's really important that individuals are educated on it and the possible impact it would have on the community as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know one of the places that we've had the opportunity to live as a family was in some of those communities outside of Reno where the brothels are still active, and just seeing the effects of legalization on communities holistically. And it's not just even on those who are being impacted by the brothels, but just the community at large can be really negative. Can you share maybe a little bit of what we were seeing in New Zealand, and what were some of the externalities that occurred as a result of those laws?
Sure. New Zealand is really held up by proponents of full decriminalization, individuals who really, what we would say like sex workers' rights advocates, what some people call sex trade expansionists, right? Individuals who see nothing wrong with expanding the sex industry, who think prostitution is a legitimate form of work that should be normalized, that should really be promoted. And what we've seen in New Zealand is that over time, it's really created a race to the bottom. It has not really provided individuals with the sex industry with more autonomy, more agency. If anything, it's created more competition, prices have dropped. It has actually made it more difficult for law enforcement to be able to detect children in the industry because they lack probable cause, for example, to enter commercial sex establishments that have now been effectively rendered legal. There's no requirement under a deregulation or decriminalization scheme to maintain age verification documents or working documents for any of the individuals inside these informal brothels or these residential brothels, what we call in the United States trap houses, that would become totally allowed, where most child sex trafficking victims in places like DC and a lot of other big cities are found. And what we've seen in places like New Zealand, and what survivors tell us, is children are being exploited with impunity, particularly Indigenous young women and girls. And the other thing that we've seen is the US State Department releases an annual TIP report, a trafficking persons report, every year. And for the last several years, they've talked about how New Zealand has actually been dropped in their tier rankings. And this has been because they have not been able to sue a single trafficking prosecution. They have not secured a single sex trafficking conviction, and they actually haven't been able to identify a single adult sex trafficking victim. And for those of us who are in the anti-violence space, we know our policies are working, our approaches are working when identifications go up. But if identifications have gone to zero, that's a pretty strong indicator that our policies are a failure. The TIP report itself is highlighting these glaring issues with the approach. And I think it's a big warning to jurisdictions that are actually considering adopting this policy, because it's very difficult to close Pandora's box once you unleash these market forces. And I think we've seen that with the legalization and decriminalization of other formerly illicit things, that it's very difficult to then go back, particularly when you see the potential profits that could be made. And when you consider organized crime and all of the other collateral crimes that are associated with prostitution, it's very different than, say, something like marijuana. The collateral crimes associated with prostitution are very serious. And I think we need to think about that.
No, absolutely. Ollie or Bill, obviously you all have seen the effects of this as well. Do you all have anything that you want to add in terms of where we've been and the different things that have happened in policy?
Bill, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that Yasmin's saying. I think one of the things that we need to think about, the identification piece is really such a huge indicator. When we look at this, one of the challenges that law enforcement has in particular is the being able to differentiate between a victim and somebody that is consensually participating. And when you take approaches like legalization or even full decrim, what it does is it blurs the lines even more. Yasmin pointed out the Netherlands, for example, doing work over there and working alongside their law enforcement. They said one of the biggest challenges that we have is the way that the laws have set up. It actually makes it easier for the traffickers, because now we don't know, as law enforcement officers, as investigators, how to really differentiate. And we know even in our country, in the United States, with the laws being what they are, again, it's increasingly difficult to differentiate, especially what we call like in the field, right? So if you have a patrol officer or even a trained investigator that encounters somebody that is involved in the commercial sex trade in a hotel or in a car or apartment, wherever it is that they may be, being able to make that determination on the spot as to whether or not they are a victim or whether or not they are a consenting participant is very difficult. I think back to one of the cases that I worked as a law enforcement officer, where a young lady was in a hotel by herself. She had money, she had her ID. There was no one else there. She was not physically being held against her will. And so the officers identified that as a consenting participant. They subsequently arrested her for prostitution. They took her to jail. She was being trafficked, and the force, fraud, or coercion was the fact that the trafficker was holding her infant child hostage. Like they essentially were holding that against her, and that was the coercive method, right? But again, when you don't see it right in front of you, it's very difficult to identify sometimes. And by taking these different approaches towards decriminalization, i.e. legalization and full decrim, what we're doing is we're making it even more difficult to identify. And really looking at the effective model that Yasmin was talking about, we call it partial decrim or the equality model, right? Which is a way that we can make sure that survivors and those that are being victimized are afforded the opportunity to access services. They're afforded the opportunity for law enforcement to do a full investigation before they can make that determination. And it's also making sure that we don't allow the illicit industries to flourish, right? Because we're increasing penalties and holding the facilitators accountable. We're holding the buyers, the demand side of the problem accountable. So you're able to still leverage law enforcement tools to go in to more effectively identify those that are being victimized and to continue to disrupt the illicit industries that exist. Oftentimes, what we hear is really pushback from the criminal justice community, from law enforcement officers, from prosecutors saying, you're taking tools out of our toolbox to be able to negotiate these different situations. The reality is we've been fighting this fight for a long time, right? Under the umbrella of safe harbor as it pertains to juveniles. And essentially what we're trying to do is now expand that into the adult world and say, you know what, adults deserve the same protections, especially when they are being victimized or potentially vulnerable to trafficking situations. I think it does require education, which is why I'm so thankful to be here today, to be joined with these incredible panelists so that we can educate the larger human trafficking community, because a lot of individuals in the field that are working, whether you're on the law enforcement side, the victim services side, even the advocacy side, don't realize that these bills and these efforts are being pushed forward. Yasmin mentioned, I remember when Washington, D.C. entered our bill just a couple of years ago, and it really caught some of us off guard within the field. We're like, you just don't imagine that these things are going to gain traction, and they really are, because there is a lobby for full decrim that is very strong and very powerful. And so we as stakeholders in this space need to educate ourselves. We need to stay on top of it and stay out in front of it to talk about why it's important that we implement effective policies like partial decrim that increase victim identification, increase access to services, and retain mechanisms to dismantle the illicit networks.
You made some great points there, Bill. Sorry, I'm going to follow up on one question quick, Alia. On that, can you speak a little bit to even just the need then for victim-centered approach to law enforcement and how important that is in a partial decrim narrative?
Yeah, so I think we could have a whole webinar on what does victim-centered mean, right? But essentially, when we talk about understanding victims' needs first, understanding the victim experience in that interaction. And so one of the biggest struggles, again, I'll relate back to my days in law enforcement as an investigator of human trafficking. When I would show up to interview or to interact with a suspected victim, a survivor of trafficking, one of the biggest challenges that I had was overcoming their initial interaction with those patrol officers, because many law enforcement are still trained, and prostitution is easy to conceptualize, right? Law enforcement arrives on scene, they see indicators of commercial sex, they know a law that they can point to, which is prostitution, and they respond accordingly. And oftentimes those victims and survivors are treated like offenders. And so we have oftentimes, Shared Hope International has done a lot of work around the victim offender intersectionality component, right? Which is a direct result of, in my opinion, of some of these policies and the existence of prostitution laws that do not take into account the ability to respond immediately in the field without an extensive investigation to a potential victim.
Perfect. Thank you. Alia, sorry.
Okay. That's okay. And I think Bill alluded to this, but I wanted to expand upon that piece of what you said, Bill, along the lines of putting these practices into place that are decriminalizing survivors, because I think that we can all agree that the current system is not working the way that it has been working all of these years. But again, doing it in a way that increases identification. And even partial decrim, which has been shown to be the most effective way to decrease the criminalization of survivors, without the proper systems in place to come alongside that to ensure service provision, can have negative outcomes. And we're seeing that here in California, where a law came, I think it was SB 357, that we had that decriminalized loitering for prostitution, which of course is what we want to see. We want to see survivors not be criminalized, but because the state and the county and city service agencies and law enforcement were not prepared on the back end for how were they going to ensure service provision without those stops for people who were on tracks and blades, what we saw was that the misinformation that was disseminated through traffickers, through pimps, to buyers and to people that were being trafficked or that were experiencing trafficking was that this is now legal for you to be here. This is legal for you to be engaging in prostitution on the blade, and there are no consequences for anyone. And so that can be used in a lot of different ways, and it really is a form of coercion. So because we didn't have any sort of information for the people on the blade beforehand, because law enforcement weren't trained in how to continue to give services, or service providers were not being trained to go out there, where there are areas where a lot of service providers did act with initiative to ensure that they were being seen when that bill changed. But because of that, we're seeing the effects of partial decriminalization without the proper hands-on approach of service providers. And I think Yasmin alluded to this in our pre-call, is like why we're all invested in this, why we all need to be invested in legislation, is because legislation impacts the survivors that we serve. And it's an all hands on deck thing. We can't just decriminalize and not pull in the service providers into those actions. And we're seeing that specific bill something similar to what was discussed earlier, in that now even there isn't even reason to stop those that may be underage, because in this day and age, a 16-year-old can look very similar to an 18-year-old. And so without that probable cause, law enforcement is having a difficult time doing that. However, if that bill had been coupled up with a task force or excessive training and other resources in order to ensure that there was a new process in effect to continue services to these people, we probably wouldn't be seeing what we are seeing as a fallout.
One of the things, just to comment quickly, that I think is interesting to note is that we can look at the intent of the law and kind of get guidance from what was originally intended by the drafters of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. One of the challenges that I had when I was Director of Human Trafficking Programs at the Department of Justice is overseeing the Enhanced Collaborative Model Task Force program. It's a grant program that is funded through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that funds both a law enforcement partner and a victim services partner. But what's interesting about the grant program is that the specific intent of those grant dollars is for victim identification, right? And so it was always a struggle because grant recipients that were operating under the ECM program wanted to conduct sting operations because that's a traditional law enforcement approach. But they would do quote unquote prostitution stings under a federal grant for human trafficking. And so we would have to say no, we'd have to deny those activities because they were not specifically aimed at identifying victims of human trafficking, but rather at arresting individuals for prostitution, which is contrary to the whole TVPA and our approach in the United States to address this problem.
So when I had a good question come through in the chat, and in the United States, do you think that something like the Nordic model being implemented, would that take place at the state level within individual states first, or do you believe that would be a federal, like, how do you see those working together or opposing each other if some states were to buy off?
So I think what makes this effort really challenging is that you can't implement this federally, right? Prostitution is a state-based issue. So part of the reason why we're able to work on trafficking policy at the federal level is because it's a federal crime and a federal issue and a state issue, but prostitution is really reserved to the states. And in order to affect policy change around prostitution, it really does have to be a state by state issue. So we wouldn't be able to affect the Nordic model or partial decriminalization at federal level, although we are able to promote some of the ideals, right? For example, our congressional champions have been very clear that demand reduction is an essential component of trafficking prevention. And they have really highlighted this, whether it's always followed by various administrations or agencies isn't always the case, but the congressional intent has been clear around a lot of these principles. But that's one of the challenges. You'd have to go through every single state and implement this policy change. And that's very daunting, right? That's very difficult, but it's important because every state has different capacity, has different services, has different agencies that would have to be responsive to the specific needs and issues of that state and jurisdiction and its population who are impacted by the sex trade, by sex trafficking, and by the various agencies. And so that's one of the challenges. So yeah, it would have to be a state by state effort. But I think to Alia's point, it's really important that you have all components ready to be implemented, right? You can't just basically affect legislative change without some of those other political and practical components ready to be implemented. Otherwise, you're really not doing the real work and you're not really helping survivors and affecting the change that needs to happen. And so that partial decriminalization approach that we discussed is the legislative act of decriminalizing the sale of sex, maintaining those other criminal prohibitions, paired with exit services for individuals who are currently in this trade, voluntary exit services, right? This isn't like forcing anyone, but voluntary exit services, as well as that demand reduction approach, right? So really making a concerted effort to help curb the demand that fuels the sex trade. And it's really principled on this notion of understanding that the demand for commercial sex is really the driver. And so understanding that one of the key measures of success around this issue is shrinking the industry. I think that's a really helpful way of understanding the difference in these policy approaches. The proponents of a partial decrim approach measure success by shrinking the industry and reducing the total number of people involved, whereas proponents of full decriminalization would expand the industry and see no problem with increasing and pulling more people in because they think it's a legitimate form of work and they see no problem with it. So I think that's a really helpful philosophical distinction.
No, I think that's very helpful. And I think what you're really highlighting there is the reason that like the TVPA speaks to the protection of survivors, those aftercare services, like what are the support services that are out there, the prosecution side with traffickers and buyers, and then prevention, in this case, being that secondary and tertiary prevention once somebody has been able to exit. And so that's where sometimes we see direct service providers going, okay, I don't have time for policy work. It's not asking you to always do policy work, but also understanding those intersection points where policy is going to impact your programming. And I don't know if Ali or Bill, you want to speak to a little bit about the importance of just policy initiatives being part of maybe somebody's 30,000-foot view, even if their day job is more in the direct care side.
I think just to kick that off, and I think policy always impacts the work on the ground, right? And oftentimes I think we forget about how these different laws impact the ability to do the work, but also impact the effectiveness of our programs, right? If you're operating in a state that ends up implementing a full decrim approach, right? What message does that send to survivors, right? So it complicates that restorative care process altogether, right? So I think that even though sometimes we don't think of policy that directly impacts us or has a direct line to the work that we're doing, it really does. It impacts the field, right? And building off of what Yasmin was saying, absolutely, this is state by state, right? You've got to go in, and because of the way that prostitution laws are and the way that our government is set up in the states, it has to be done state by state. But there's also ways that we can influence that, right? There's ways that the federal government can incentivize by expanding services, right? Expanding funding for those services, and then paying certain things to that and saying, okay, if you're going to access services, many states will go after things like the Enhanced Collaborative Model Task Force grants, right? Offices of Attorneys General and things like that. And saying, listen, if you want to be engaged in these activities, then you've got to be in line with the spirit of the law, right? And that is that our focus is on identifying survivors, connecting them to restorative care options, right? Increasing access to housing, mental health, things of that nature that are critically important. So again, one of the things I just want to emphasize with that is there's always the direct line approach, right? There's the direct line approach to change, and there's the direct line to how it impacts us and the work that we're doing in the field. But there's also the indirect, right? So bad policy can indirectly affect the work that we're all doing in the field, but there's also ways to indirectly influence it as well to try to get a similar result.
No, you bring up a really good point. And so how, like, as maybe direct care providers at the state levels, can people engage to help educate their senators, their congressional representatives about the opportunities and the needed expansion of services to really effectively serve survivors? We've touched on restorative care, but as you mentioned, that is not the only support service. We need to look at means for economic independence, for career advancement. We're looking at just a lot of different avenues in which we need to support survivors. And I think that it's those working with survivors every day who have the intelligence that has to be bubbled back up to policymakers in order for real meaningful change to come about.
I think it's also, if I may, Ali, I'd definitely defer to you on this, but I think one of the things that we need to do a better job at is elevating the survivor voice. So those that are deemed sex workers in the space, they're advocating, they have a very loud voice, even though they're a small group of individuals. And I think we as stakeholders, for those that are survivor leaders, but also for those that are working alongside survivor leaders, we need to be elevating their voice so that their stories and their perspective can be heard from the legislators as well, so that they understand that when you have a small group that comes forward and says, this is our view on legalization or decriminalization, they know that there is a larger group that says, wait a minute, that's not how we see it, and those were not our experiences.
I'd like to jump in after that. Thank you, Bill. I think that within the survivor communities that I'm privileged to be a part of, that has really been the general consensus. And there is a frustration there around exactly what you were explaining, Bill, that many voices have been framed to be many voices when there are only a few voices. And yet there have not been a lot of avenues for the mass of survivors who maybe have chosen to step into this field or have chosen to use their voice in another way, but want to speak into this piece to advocate for what they believe to be right. And I'm privileged enough to sit on a board, a multidisciplinary board, of a very diverse board of survivors. And I was really interested to see that we all, while we had different shared experiences, the shared experience of having experienced trafficking, how we experienced that trafficking was different. Our demographics were very different. And yet each of us had very similar views regarding this specific topic. And that was really interesting to me. And I had the honor of being a part of a panel that they did this month for Human Trafficking Awareness Month that really focused heavily on the different models around decriminalization and kind of survivor reactions to those. And in our pre-calls, when we were discussing what full decrim would mean, there were a lot of very visceral reactions to that in the survivor community. And just, it was bringing up a lot of feelings of experiences not being seen and of experiences not being valued for as horrendous or damaging as they were. There was a lot of conversation around how that piece, those people who are very ardently proposing full decrim, that there is a narrative there that this will decrease stigma, which will then decrease violence against people who are in sex work, and that they won't experience many of the horrendous things that many of us in the survivor community have experienced if full decrim happens. And yet the consensus and the conversation in the survivor group that I got to be a part of was that this stigma will not be affected by this full decrim model. And that stigma really comes from the community and not necessarily from legislation or from law enforcement even. It can definitely be compounded with poor law enforcement reactions, but it doesn't necessarily come from that. And the desire to be seen and to shed that stigma, and what stigma can do is it can't be ended in one action. It can't be ended in one piece of legislation. And in fact, stigma doesn't end at one point in a person's life, but we had discussions around how the stigma of being involved in prostitution or the stigma of being trafficked carried on not just throughout that person's experience of being trafficked, but into the rest of their life and into their children's lives often as well. And so I think that what we can do is, again, like Bill said, walk alongside of people who have lived this experience, right? And hear from those things, and not just on decrim, right? But we know this on service provision. We know this on I got to do a wonderful training with law enforcement last month that was where the surveys at the end of that were, we want to hear from more people with lived experience. This is what we want. Like, the desire for that voice is there. And it's our job as survivors who have that position now to broaden that aperture of who gets to come to the table, and for allies and other people in support roles and other people in leading roles within this industry to continue to elevate that. And I was just shocked by the amount of survivors that had similar opinions on decriminalization. And unless we're continuing to open the spaces to have survivors speak into this, we're not going to know that, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so the loudest voices are going to be the voices that are heard. And there are a lot of people in pain. And I always like to say that I believe that the survivors that are on the pro decrim or legalization sides of this, that many of them have intentions that are in line with my own and are in line with the other piece of the community, that their intentions are that they want to be seen. Their intentions are that they don't want to be hurt anymore, that they want want to feel safe reporting a rape, that they want to feel safe disseminating information about a John that was harmful, that they want to feel valued, and that for many, that they have felt out of options. And so this is the only option society has given me. So don't penalize me for this option. And so I think that it's our job to not, again, widen the trafficking industry for this, but is to come alongside and say, okay, then what is the gap? How do we need to change those things without creating more victimization? Because that seems like the easy way out to me.
No, I think you put that beautifully. And we definitely, at the end of the day, what makes this issue so hard is that there are individuals who have experienced violence on both sides of it. And so I love that you speak to the fact that it isn't about polarizing one person or another based on their lived experience, but it's about how do we recognize which gaps are there? How do we figure out effective policies at all levels in order to protect everybody from gender-based violence or from sexual violence or whatever that kind of, wherever it aligns within there. And I appreciate you just making sure that we keep in mind that this is a human issue and that these things are impacting people and it isn't about numbers. And sometimes it's easy to get lost in like the narrative of policy or the narrative of studies or this, that, or whatever. And that just draws it back to that at the end of the day, we want to serve and love people well and make people feel seen and heard. I did want to just say that I am going to jump into the chat. We had a great question come over about studies that support the partial decrim model, because there are so many studies that promote the other avenues. So we'll drop that into the chat. And so with that, what are some new research that needs to be out there? As we continue to evolve this conversation, what all do you see are the opportunities to expand the literature, so to speak, or expand the body of research to support different narratives?
Well, there's been some really great research. I know the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women just put together an excellent new resource that's New York focused, but I know there's efforts to perhaps expand it and make it multi-jurisdiction. But one of the questions that they and others have been posing is, at a time where we're looking and critiquing how our community is looking down upon like things like racism, sexism, and misogyny, how is it that sex buyers get a pass? And if you look at the comments that so many sex buyers post on John boards, and for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, these are like Yelp for sex buyers for prostitution, where they go and basically review their experiences in prostitution and talk about those experiences. And so they did a really great report. I can put the link in the chat, but they basically did this excellent report where they basically highlighted, should offer a content warning. It's pretty intense, but they directly quote sex buyers from different jurisdictions in New York and the comments that they make about the women and sometimes girls and individuals that they're purchasing, and just the very demeaning, dehumanizing comments that they make about these individuals. And they actually did a PSA, and I see Christian Eduardo, who's amazing, our leader and activist who has done incredible work. And I know he was instrumental in that campaign and PSA, and they did a very cool video on that whole issue. And I think it's very moving. I know we've shared it with individuals who had a very visceral reaction. And I think those types of campaigns, sharing them, helping people recognize this isn't a victimless crime, and just really reassessing what we think about these individuals, right? If we as a community can see the harm that someone like Harvey Weinstein has done, like, why then can we not see the harm that this often invisible category of men is inflicting on some of the most marginalized people in our communities? So I think that type of research is really important. There's also been increasing efforts to look at the harm of sexual exploitation, the long-term invisible trauma, right? The long-term psychological effects of unwanted sexual contact. Something that we talk about in our work at Rights for Girls is there a difference between raping someone and paying to rape someone? Does that act of paying for sexual assault erase the harm of unwanted sex? And I think we need to think about that and the repeated act, right? And I think studies into that are very important. And so I think a body of research to look at that, I know we had legislated it. Once again, it doesn't mean it gets done. We've been working to try to get it implemented in the Abolish Human Trafficking Act of 2018. we legislated a joint study between the CDC and NIH to examine the harms of sexual exploitation, to look at the impact. And I think that's really important, because if there's an entire category of people talking about this as a job, what other job has the occupational hazards of rape and murder and just regular dehumanization on a daily basis? So there was a study a number of years ago that showed waitresses at places like Hooters were dealing with just being sexually objectified over and over. They had all kinds of mental health and eating disorders, all types of issues. And just think about what individuals in the sex trade are experiencing, some of whom have been for a number of years. And so I think it's really important to look at the harms, not just of what individuals who are in the industry are experiencing, but also some of the damage that the other actors who participate in the industry are experiencing as well. Oh, thank you. And Christian has shared the link to the report and the video. I don't know if that's going to all of the participants, but if you can share that, it's a really great work from Cat W. It deserves to be shared.
Wonderful. So one more question before we wrap it up today would be, are there any states that we feel like are considering implementation of the Nordic model, or that we see momentum building in that? Or are there states that we're aware of that are pushing for the legalization or full decriminalization that we also need to be aware of?
Yes, and I am actually putting a link to an article in that chat, and maybe we can share it and I'll put it in the chat too. Today, an op-ed was published by 3 legislators from Maine, New York, and Massachusetts that are lead sponsors of equality model legislation in their states. And they did a joint op-ed today promoting the equality model and denouncing full decriminalization, which is great. So those are 3 states that we have bills currently pending that promote the equality model. Massachusetts and New York also have full decrim bills also introduced. So they have dueling bills. Maine does not as of yet. Maine just has an equality model bill, which is great. We're working on all those jurisdictions with a number of survivors. These are survivor-led efforts, which have been really great. I know Minnesota also has some efforts there's a survivor-led coalition in Minnesota looking to introduce equality model legislation, what they're calling safe harbor for all, based on expanding their really successful safe harbor efforts there. And places like Oregon, we're working with the Northwest Survivors Alliance there to look at legislation there. And Christian is part of the New Yorkers for the Equality Model Coalition. They have a very strong survivor-led coalition in New York that has been doing excellent work there. So for anyone who is part of New York, in the state of New York, you should definitely get involved with that. They're doing great work. They have great resources for people who are asking for resources. Their website has excellent resources on these issues that you should take a look at, just generally around the equality model. So there's a lot of really great work happening. But to your other question about full decrim, yes, there's a number of full decrim bills, including ballot initiatives in a number of states, Oregon, Vermont. There was a bill in Louisiana before. We expect it to come back either at the city level or state. In New York, Massachusetts, and I'm blanking. There's a number. Hawaii just introduced a couple of weeks ago. We have a call about that later today. It's literally Illinois. If there's Illinois folks, that's going to be a huge problem. Illinois, it's being led by a C4, which is going to be very difficult. They have no limits on their advocacy there. So all hands on deck. If you're in Illinois, please reach out. We need all the help we can get there. And there's just a lot. It's every day there's a new jurisdiction. As Alia said, we need all the help we can get. This is a well-funded effort. People forget the sex industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's on the verge of becoming legitimate. So they have lobbyists, they have PR, people forget. And so I think we need all the support we can get. This is very well funded.
No, you make great points. And I think that everybody just needs to recognize that if this has not been on your radar, that this is something to consider. And for those on the call that are part of the Trafficking Survivor Equity Coalition, this is something that we're definitely keeping a pulse on, and obviously deferring to Yasmin and groups that are doing it state by state, but wanting to make sure that we keep you all apprised of things that are happening and how you can support as stakeholders, because it is so critical to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. I think one of the things that I want to make sure you heard what Yasmin just said is that these are very well-funded initiatives that are coming through for full legalization. These are not sideways conversations that are happening to get to this point. it is billions of dollars being invested into this. And that narrative is very strong. And so I don't know if Ali or Bill, you have, go ahead.
Just to give you an example, last year, the ballot initiative that was introduced in Oregon was being funded by a billionaire named Aaron Boonshoft, who was just an independently wealthy sex buyer. This guy was just a self-professed sex buyer. You can Google him. He just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the Nevada brothels, moved to Portland, wanted something closer to home, just financed this entire ballot initiative. And we were able to work with survivors there and file a legal challenge. But this is what we're dealing with, right? It's shameless. And we were fortunate that it was just this like sex buyer in Oregon, but in some states, it's like a much more sympathetic, like a nonprofit. And it looks very different. That gentleman has since moved to New Zealand where he can just access it whenever he wants, but he's still funding. We found out that he donated $500,000 in the last few weeks of the election to the Progressive Caucus in Oregon. So we're dealing with that. Like it's not a joke. There's so much money being thrown at this issue, and it really is all hands on deck. And to Aaliyah's point earlier, even if you don't work on policy, this impacts your issue. This is going to impact all aspects of sex trafficking. If you are already at capacity and we already have a major sex trafficking problem, imagine what it's going to look like if sex buying is legal and pimping becomes legal. We already are dealing with a crisis. So it's a huge problem. And again, a lot of these bills got a hearing. They got to the hearing phase with a lot of support. Like in DC, this bill received a hearing. It had 5 co-sponsors. And it was a 14-hour hearing with probably more people supporting the bill than opposing it. So it's same with Louisiana. We were way outnumbered. We were just fortunate that the legislators were turned off at the 11th hour, but it's very serious what's happening.
I want to just add one little quick point. Sorry. One of the sort of opposition points or the things that oftentimes people get a little skittish about speaking out on this is that they're met with this, you're the morality police, right? But I just want to stress, this is not a moral issue, right? We all know from being in this space, the victims of human trafficking are very real. The impacts are lifelong and life-altering. And so don't ever be deterred by thinking that somebody's going to come at you and say, we're just against legalization of commercial sex from a moral perspective, right? There is sufficient evidence and research out there, and certainly the lived experience voice that can testify to the fact that these are very real victims and the impacts on our society are very real, right? So that ripple effect outside of just our industry alone. So I just want to encourage you all to not be discouraged by some of the negative things that may be said if you do take up a voice in this space, and to really use your voice and what you're seeing from the field to advocate for common sense solutions like partial decrim that put safeguards in place for survivors.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you can feel the passion of everybody on this call to just serve survivors well and make sure that their voices are the ones that are elevated to really drive this forward. So thank you, Alia, Bill, Yasmin, for just your time, your expertise. Hopefully everybody just found this extremely fruitful. So we appreciate you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week or month.
And there will be a survey going out as well. So if you all can take a time to do that as well, it's really helpful so that we can continue to bring these to you and do it in a way that's helpful for you all.
Perfect.